access to it afterwards and can learn together and use it to reflect and continue to layer the learning. So thank you everyone for joining in today. My name is Cody Russell and I'm the director of Kitsap Strong. Glad to be gathered together again on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people who since time immemorial have nurtured our shared lands and waterways, the lands and waterways that enable my family to flourish here. And I'm glad that we are able to gather together as they have since time immemorial to nurture our minds, bodies, our souls, and to connect together and learn together. We believe that learning is an impact and relationships are an outcome. And that's our goal for this training, is to nurture and facilitate learning and relationships. So thank you for joining with us, and we'll dive in and continue this journey about trauma-informed care and the science of hope. Let's get this going here. So what to expect from today? We are going to touch on the first component of hope, visioning. And we're going to talk a little bit about visioning. We'll have a little reflective activity after that. And then we're going to hit on these two ingredients of trauma-informed care: impact, the impact of trauma, how it impacts our brains and bodies. And then we'll also start to talk about this concept of perspective shift, which is the really powerful intervention of changing the way that we think. And often that is the intervention that our clients need the most, is for us to change the way that we think about and understand them and to approach them in a slightly different, subtle, but super profound ways. So that's what we'll be exploring today together. Just a reminder of our community agreements for this session. I'm inviting us to choose authenticity over comfort. Again, the curriculum is designed to be a little bit provocative, to push us a little bit, because that's where our learning occurs. That we want to embrace messiness and kindness, a reminder that all models are wrong, some are useful. So there's always going to be those outliers. There's always going to be the things that this doesn't quite explain, but my hope is that we're introducing a model that is useful, that we're going to practice personal and group accountability. We'll be aware of equity of voice. So I invite you to take yourselves off of mute and share in the chat and ask questions as they come to you. We're also going to listen in the same way that we want to be heard, and we're going to honor subjectivity versus objectivity, right? Create space for multiple truths simultaneously. So a reminder here about the way that we've collectively working on a definition of hope is that hope is the belief that tomorrow will be better than today and that you have the power to make it so. Again, hope has an action component to it. And just a reminder of the three components of hope. The first one is this vision of a future outcome. And that vision can be short-term, like I want to finish today without raising my voice, right? That's a goal that you got today. I want to make it through that difficult client interaction and I want to not raise my voice, or whatever that may look like. That's a short term. And the ability to actually picture what that looks like. What does it look like if I'm able to achieve that goal? Because our agency, our motivation is directly tied to how rich that vision is. And then our way power, our pathway thinking, is the way that we construct the steps to achieving that goal. Because if you're going to achieve that goal, you may need to employ a couple of different strategies in order to accomplish that goal. And again, a reminder that agency without a pathway is a wish. I've seen the forecast, and it's all the news in my household that we are going to get anywhere from 3 to apparently 75 inches of snow. It's totally unknown. But the idea here is that none of us have control over the weather, right? So we may have a desire about snow or not. That's our motivation, but none of us have a pathway to influencing the weather. And the thing I love most about hope, when I think about this theory, when I think about this model, the thing I enjoy the most about it is that I think it's something that you're already doing. We're just not paying attention to it. In fact, I'd argue that for the clients that you improve outcomes for, it's likely that you first build a sense of hope. You nurture the type of relationship where they see you as a pathway towards their goal, and you somehow effectively center their goal in the case plan, in whatever you're doing with them, so that they actually see you as a pathway towards accomplishing their goal, and they have the motivation to take the necessary steps to accomplishing that goal. So I would argue that hope is beautiful in its simplicity, and that it starts with goals, having a cognitive endpoint, some neurological, some mental vision for what you want to accomplish. The key thing here is that second bullet, is that it must be sufficient to motivate behavior. And all too often, we construct goals for our clients instead of co-constructing goals with our clients. And I'll speak candidly here, in child welfare, we almost never had a conversation about goals with the parents. It was just implied. It was understood that they had two general goals anytime as a CPS investigator, I got involved with them. Their first goal was that they wanted their children back. Their second goal was that they wanted us out of their life, right? And so we didn't talk about either of those goals. It was understood, it was implicit. But what actually I found was that when I started to have conversations about that goal, and I started to vision with the families that I worked with what their goal was, really powerful things occurred. I remember this interaction with a mom where I just asked her, what do you want? And she used some rather colorful language, but she very clearly articulated that she wanted her kids back and she wanted me out of her life. And I said, okay, what does it look like when your children are back with you? And we sat there in silence for a little bit. And then she started to articulate to me, well, we got that apartment back across from the park where they love to play. And my kids are in school and they're doing good. They love their teacher. And I'm sober. And I got my job back. And I ended it with him. He's out of the house and he's not hurting any of us anymore. I finally ended it with him. It still kind of chokes me up because this was a mom who was actually purchasing urine online in order to pass drug tests. And it wasn't magic. After that conversation, everything didn't just suddenly change. But I can tell you one thing that did change. She didn't try and purchase urine online again after that conversation. Because up until that point, she didn't see me as a pathway, she saw me as a barrier. And we are creative, amazing, intelligent humans. We will find awesome ways around barriers. But until we had that conversation and I took the time to center her goal and hear what her goal was, you see, in her own vision of the future, she was sober. So now she saw that drug test as a pathway holding her accountable to accomplishing her own vision for her future. So that pathway, that mental roadmap, we are pathways on the journey of our clients' healing and their sobriety and their mental well-being if we help them see us as such. Otherwise, if we're not good about articulating that goal, they may just view us as a barrier and they'll figure out ways around us. And then the last one is around the willpower. And this, again, is about visioning. Way too often, and I'm ashamed to say again, there was a mantra in our social work office that said, you can't work harder than a parent, right? And when a parent failed to meet kind of the expectations or the case plan, the rationale, the way that we understood that as social workers was that the parents just weren't motivated enough. We were fundamentally not understanding the neuroscience. We didn't understand that willpower is first about self-regulation. It's about motion regulation. It's about executive functioning. And if you can't focus your attention on the goal, you're going to really have a difficult time deploying your energy towards that goal. And I can't think of anything that would be more dysregulating than someone telling me that my child had just been removed for child abuse and neglect concerns. Like, you can guarantee that you're going to dysregulate somebody. You're going to push them beyond their stress capacity when you're having that sort of interaction. So let's start with setting some goals. I want you to reflect right now. think about goal setting and the way that you set goals with the clients that you serve, the students that you work with, whatever language you use to describe the humans that you serve. So I want us to think for a second here. Maybe I'll put on another song for us, but I want you to answer these two questions. You can put it in the chat, or you can reflect individually and just write it on a piece of paper for yourself. But how do you help people dream? And how do you communicate to them what you think they're capable of achieving? Because that's really powerful. So often a mentor sees in us something that we don't yet see in ourselves and help us achieve something that we never dreamed possible. So how do you help people dream, and how do you communicate to them what you think they're capable of achieving? Just go ahead and throw your ideas in the chat there.
I'm working on my phone, so I need to, I'm having a hard time getting into the chat. So can I just make a comment here?
Please.
Okay, everything you're talking about, I work for PCAP through First Step and out at Port Angeles, and everything you have just described is why I left my past employment and went to PCAP, because we start with goals. Goals is our number one. After Christina, our supervisor, does the intake and determines that, yes, this is something we can work together on. Each case manager, the first thing they do with their client is we ask the client what their goals are. Just as you had described in your experience, that is the first thing we do. So that, and we do it in front of them. We sit down and we write them out together, and we indicate to them and across the board to each other that we understand what the client wants to accomplish out of this. We also indicate what they would like for us to do to help them to achieve those goals. Because we're not an agency. We're not we're not DCYF, we're not CPS. And then those pathways are also outlined in those goals. And we revisit those every 4 months. So that's, that's how we stay on track, so to speak. And your agency willpower, the mantra that you talked about, again, is another reason why I left where I used to work and came to PCAP, because I personally saw that as a wall to being able to help my clients. I was very limited in what I could offer them, where with PCAP, that's where we start.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just wanted to get that out there, because we come from a totally different direction than DCYF. So.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that, LaDonna. I think it's a perfect illustration of the science that I was just trying to articulate. So thank you for that. And I'm seeing some great comments in the chat too here, assuming that people will never be stuck in their current circumstances and that growth is always possible. So being able to communicate that to humans is really important, right? I love this idea of bringing kids to their interests: books, theater, museums, science, right? Following where they lead you. Kids are inherently curious. And if we just follow that, that's how you build a sense of motivation. Because I think what happens there is you're telling them that their goals are worthy of pursuit and worthy of action. And many members of our community, especially those who've experienced lots of adversity, they may be coming to you and they've had repeated instances in their life where people have told them that whatever goal they had was not worthy of action. Whatever they were dreaming of, they were incapable of, they shouldn't try. And they've got that internal narrative going on, right? And if you say in your head, I suck, I'm no good, there's literally different neurons that are connecting when you say that. Versus if you say, I'm awesome, I'm amazing, there is literally different neurons that are connecting when you make those different statements. So the way we talk to and about ourselves is a really powerful thing and can actually influence a lot of our behaviors and actions. So I love the ideas in the chat. Thank you so much for sharing them out there. I'm going to keep us going here because I think you guys are getting this. I appreciate that. So back to this idea around visioning. As Jason Rogers, Olympic fencer, says, when you close your eyes and paint the full sensory picture of achieving your goal, it's like giving your brain a practice round. Right? So if you can close your eyes and literally picture what it looks like when you've accomplished your goal, maybe that's a promotion that you're seeking, or finishing your graduate degree, or finishing your high school diploma, earning your CDP credential or SUD credential, right? Substance use disorder professional. They changed the name on me and I'm struggling. I apologize. My point is, if you can close your eyes and truly picture it, our motivation is connected to both emotions and experiences. And that visioning is powerful because it allows us to create an emotional memory of a future experience. So if you envision like Michael Phelps here or our Winter Olympians, right? Usually they have their headphones on, they have their eyes closed, and you can watch them standing by the edge of the pool or standing at the top of the mountain, looking down the mountain. And they're literally kind of bobbing and weaving as they're imagining each stroke or each turn down the mountain. They're literally firing every single neuron, and every muscle fiber is twitching exactly as if they were going down the mountain. They're giving themselves another attempt down the mountain just by picturing it so deeply and so clearly. That is incredible. That's the incredible power of our brain and what it can do for us. So visioning, back to that story that I had with that mom, that vision builds the intrinsic motivation, and intrinsic motivation is the internal driver. And it is the most durable form of motivation. Extrinsic motivation is the carrot or the stick that we as service providers often have that we try and reward or reinforce behavior with. But those are insufficient towards long-term behavior change. You've got to build intrinsic motivation. And I wanted to take this moment here to also think about, how do we do this right now in our system? So again, I believe that you are already hope builders in our community. And if we disaggregate out our data, we may see that some individuals we're not doing as good a job at building hope with as others. And part of that might be that the pathways themselves were whiteness, meaning they were constructed from a white dominant paradigm, and that they also are constructed for men. Oh, my internet connection is unstable. Thanks. That's gonna make me freak out. Sorry, y'all. So I'm borrowing here from an amazing speech from Isidris Elba, who talks about this idea of talent being everywhere, opportunity is not, and talent can't reach opportunity unaided. Right? So what he's describing, he uses the story of Olympians. In the last Winter Olympics, over 70% of the British Olympians attended a private high school, but only 10%, actually less than 10% of their general population attends a private high school. They're getting over 70% of their athletes from less than 10% of their population. How many amazing athletes, amazing Olympians are they missing out on because they don't construct equitable pathways to that opportunity? Right now, the pathway to those Olympic sports is largely constructed through the private high school system. And this isn't just in Olympics or in athletics. This is across the board. Harvard, Stanford, and MIT combined together to do research of over 1 million inventors to find the secret sauce to their talent. Guess what? It's not about talent, it's about opportunity. The study found that the unifying characteristic across these 1 million inventors was not that they were exceptionally brilliant and different than everybody else. It was that they had opportunities. They had opportunities for their amazing brilliance to reach the rest of us and become amazing new inventions. To illustrate this one step further, I'm going to share a story here. And I want to be reminded that hope is contextual, meaning that if you're working with if you're working with a client who's experiencing low hope, it might be because of their current circumstances It may also be because their narrative around their lived experience up until that point. And that we can do something to shift their narrative by, doing those sorts of conversations where we help them from a strengths-based, I saw that in the chat, from a strengths-based perspective, pull out the things that they're exceptional at, help them find in their own narrative that they've done hard things and they can do hard things again. So I think that we need to be mindful that hope is contextual, and that if an individual we're working with is low hope, we need to consider what is the context around that. Is there something about the experience that we're creating that is leading to them feeling a sense of low hope? So I'm going to share this story here really quick. This comes from Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson. It's an interview with Nichelle Nichols. She was the original Lieutenant Uhura on Star Trek. And the story goes, Lieutenant Uhura had just decided that she was going to quit the show, and she turned in her letter of resignation because she wanted to go back to Broadway. And she's a classically trained Broadway actress, and that's what she wanted to do. And her role on the television show had inspired some people to fund a new project. So she's super excited. She turns in her letter of resignation, and the producer says, "You can't quit. Don't you understand what I'm trying to do here? This is bigger than you. Your role is critical to the show." And she's like, "I really appreciate it. I love all that you've done for me, but look, I want to go back to Broadway." So he says, "I'll give you the weekend." So she goes that weekend. She's a celebrity guest at an NAACP fundraiser event in Beverly Hills. And one of the promoters comes up to her and says, "Miss Nichols, your biggest fan wants to meet you." So she starts to follow this promoter across the room, and he's walking her towards this individual who she had never met yet. And she looks up and sees a man that she describes as her leader, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And she says in the interview, this is a man who she'd been watching nightly on the TV show or on the news. And this is in the 1960s, where Black people are literally being hosed down with fire hose and having dogs turned on them for sitting at a lunch counter. And she said she remembers thinking, this man is going to die for what he's doing in our society, and he's my leader. And so I don't care who this promoter wants me to talk to, I'm going to go meet this man. So she walks over there, and the promoter then says, "Miss Nichols, I'd like you to meet your biggest fan, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr." And she said she saw this brilliant, beautiful smile that she rarely got to see on the TV. And then he starts to tell her how important her role is in society. Says, your TV show, you being on that show, is so important. We let our girls stay up, we let our kids stay up late to watch you on the TV because it's so important that they see you there. She said, I'm really sorry, but I've actually turned in my letter of resignation. And he says, no, you can't. You can't quit, Miss Nichols. You don't understand. This is bigger than you. Because right now, in a time when there are members in our society who don't even want Black people to be members of our community, you are on the TV in the future, in someone's depiction of the future, and you're there. And because it's on TV, it means that it's a possibility. And not only are you there, you are fourth in command on the starship setting off to places unknown. You cannot leave, Miss Nichols. You don't understand. This is bigger than you. It still chokes me up, and you have to listen to I can't do the interview justice. But the story continues, and Whoopi Goldberg credits her entire career with seeing Miss Nichols on the TV. She says she remembers being 9 years old, turning on the TV, and then running around her house yelling, "Mom, Mom, there's a Black woman on TV and she ain't nobody's maid." You see, she believed she was capable of something because our society gave her a picture of something that she didn't yet know was possible for her. And this is the white privilege that our society extends to my sons. Because we can turn on the TV tonight and we can see white men doing literally anything. I can go to the library and have easy access to individuals and stories of individuals who look like my sons and their accomplishments to our community. Representation really matters. We have a Navy nurse in our community right now who is a dual language speaking, providing native Spanish language services to family members in our community. And he shares that he was 9 years old when he walked into the doctor's office. It was the first time that he heard someone speaking Spanish. Up until that point, he didn't know that you could do those two things. He didn't know that you could be a medical provider and speak Spanish. And he is a first generation college student. He's a first generation. He went through the military because that was the pathway that he had to create. But from that moment on, when he was 9 years old and heard somebody speaking his native language in a doctor's office, it changed what he believed he was capable of achieving in his life. So I want us to acknowledge that, that implicit bias is just a reality. And what I mean by that is that when we look at the world, we are looking for patterns. And the patterns that we believe to be true are constructed through our culture, through our cultural understanding. If I held up an apple right now, all of you would see an apple. You may not know the variety of apple, but you would make an association based on seeing that apple, and you would start to make decisions about that apple. Maybe you love apples, and so you'd start to salivate, right? So if we acknowledge that that associations are just the reality, then we need to be mindful about trying to figure out what are the associations that exist in our mind. And for this, we're going to talk a little bit today about the implicit association test, but I want to touch on some amazing work from Jeffrey Cohen here quickly. So he does some work called Turning Points, Targeted, Tailored, and Timely Interventions. One example of this is a 7th grade teacher feedback, where he develops a neutral and a wise intervention. It's a single handwritten note from a social studies teacher. In the neutral intervention, it just says, I'm giving you this feedback so you can improve, so you can rewrite your essay and improve your grade. And in the wise intervention, it says, I'm giving you this feedback because I believe you're capable of more, and I want you to rewrite your essay and turn it back in to improve your grade. Right? Subtle, but in that second message, the teacher is articulating something about expectations, a belief that you're capable of more. The reason why they do this intervention in the 7th grade is because 7th grade, the research suggests, is when students of color begin to lose faith in the educational system in general. And it turns out this intervention has zero impact for the white children in the classroom. But for the African-American children, 17% of the kids in the control group rewrote their essay. 17%, compared to 72% that had that note that just had that extra little bit that said, I believe you're capable of more. 72% of the African-American students rewrote their essay. And then they followed these students for another 7 years, and they found statistically significant improved educational outcomes for those kids that had that wise intervention. I don't think it's the one note that changes that child's trajectory, but what I do believe happens is that that one note disrupts that implicit bias that the teacher may not have even known was occurring in the classroom. And this doesn't just happen across race, this happens across gender as well, or sex. And they've seen this with even female teachers grading female students worse on math and grading male students better on their math. And when they send their tests and they send it off and they remove all identifying information, there's a statistically significant difference in the way that another teacher scores their math tests, right? So we have these implicit associations that we may not even be conscious of, but that could be influencing our expectations for the client or what we're communicating to them about what we believe they're capable of. And there is lots of research that shows that individuals perform up to the expectations that we set for them. So I'm going to skip that one, but I want us to reflect on this. We're going to send you to a small group for like 4 minutes here. And I want you to thinking about hope and what we've talked about thus far this morning. What is top of mind for you? And what is your role in helping other people dream? So what we've just shared, I want you to go to a small group and just reflect on whatever's top of mind for you and what you think your role is in helping other people dream. Well, Marlena, do you want to send them for like 4 minutes to a room? Thank you so much. You might want to pause the recording if you want. Recording again. Nice.
Oops.
That was my timer.
You're off mute, just FYI, Marlena. All right, thank you, friends. Hope you engaged in a good, quick conversation there. Sorry, I know it's always a little disjointing to jump back and forth virtually from room to room.
So weird. We couldn't find each other. And
Oh, no. Welcome back. Thank you. Appreciate your willingness to lean into that. I know it can be less than ideal jumping back and forth virtually from room to room. Any quick reflections on the role of building hope or thoughts that someone would like to share before we dive into the first component of trauma-informed care?
Hi, my name is Amy. I just want to reflect very quickly on the in my small group. We talked a lot about how it's difficult to actually maintain hope when the situation is sort of hopeless in the real world. Specifically, we talked about housing, and we touched a little bit on how that affects us. Holding on to hope and creating that for a caseload of people can be pretty difficult. But thank you for the breakout opportunity. That was wonderful.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Amy. Yeah, actually, that we worked with our cold weather shelter here in Bremerton a couple of years ago and introduced the hope scale there because they observed that the metric that they'd been given for success was how many individuals they were able to transition into stable housing. They have no control over housing in our community, right? So like, how defeating is it to go in every day and be responsible for an outcome that you literally have no influence over? And so we started to talk about, like, I think that it's an unfair assessment of the amazing services that you provide to our community. And maybe we should start looking at hope. And so they started to try and measure hope and acknowledge that, you know what, maybe we aren't able to stably house people because literally we have no control over that. But maybe we're able to build a sense of hope, even in the face of really hopeless situation, right? So I appreciate that, Amy.
Love that. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, friends. So thank you so much for that. We're going to keep this party going here. We're going to continue on with trauma-informed care. And hopefully you're seeing how these things are interconnected, how hope and trauma-informed care are two models that I think play well nicely together. So just a reminder that there's a lot more to come. We're going to be touching on impact today and perspective shift. So impact is basically talking about, we're going to touch a little bit on adverse childhood experiences, which we've talked about before, and which I think many of you are already familiar with. We're going to, again, reminder of the term toxic stress. We'll watch a video about that. We're going to be paying a lot more attention and trying to think about the stress response that occurs within humans. Explore this idea around triggers and epigenetics, and then this the worldview, our perspective on the world. So you've probably seen a slide like this. I literally have over 100 different slides like this with different health outcomes at the top, and they're showing the dose-response relationship, meaning the more toxic stress, the more adverse childhood experiences you've experienced, so the higher your ACE score, the more likely you are to develop health and social challenges across the lifespan. And this is at a population level. Again, the ACE score, if you remember back from our last session, the ACE score is not a predictive tool. So it's not helpful for you to do your own ACE score and then say, oh my gosh, I'm at this risk for obesity or lung disease, right? Like, that's not exactly how it works. But at a population level, we start to see trends, and we see these types of trends where we see a drastic increase in injected drugs and attempted suicide, a 12 times the amount of individuals with 4 or more ACEs compared to an individuals with 0 ACEs. And this is when we're just talking about those 10 adverse childhood experiences. I would argue that if we got more inclusive in our definition and the types of adversity we were paying attention to, I bet you would see an even higher percentage. So this translates to 78% of IV drug use is associated with adverse childhood experiences. I bet you if we got more inclusive, we'd get a lot closer to, 90, 99% of IV drug use being associated with some sort of adaptive response to trauma. And these are all the different ACE attributable health outcomes. So everything from depression and fetal death to suicide attempts and smoking and STDs and multiple sexual partners and a 20-year decrease in lifespan. In fact, when we do the data here in Washington State, that data that I showed you last time that showed the community variation, we stop collecting data, or we throw out the data of everyone over the age of 65 because individuals over the age of 65 are overrepresentative of individuals with less than 3 adverse childhood experiences. Right? So it's not representative of our whole community because unfortunately individuals have started dying already. So let's think about toxic stress in the body. And for this, I'm going to show you a video from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, which is a fabulous resource to just help us quickly understand these concepts. So this is their toxic stress video. And this again is in the resource link document that Marlena will drop in the chat.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
So perhaps you've seen that video before. It's a pretty good illustration of this concept of toxic stress. And it also invites us to think a little bit differently about behaviors that we see. And one of our local experts in this field, her name's Tiff Sudella Junker, and she runs an organization called X Parenting. But she talks about this concept of can't versus won't. And sometimes the behavior that we are trying to address, we think is that they just won't stop doing something, right? And she uses the illustration of her daughter who she adopted from the foster care system, used to run her fingers down the walls of her down the walls of her house. And she said that it looked like a skating rink where there was just black marks all over, and it just annoyed her, right? And this is a mom who's deeply loving and trying to build a sense of empathy and understanding, but there was this thing that triggered her, right? That her walls were constantly dirty and she was like really frustrated. and went and started listening and learning to some of the neuroscience from Dr. Bruce Perry. And she went up and actually talked to him after one of his presentations and explained this behavior. And she said, my daughter just won't stop doing this, won't stop running her hands on the walls. And he said, I think what you mean is that she can't stop doing it. And she said, what? She said, your daughter is actually prioritizing just being able to stand upright, right? So this is actually a need around your body, your body and your balance and ability to know where you're at in space and time. And he said, your daughter's prioritizing that need. That need's more important for her than meeting the need that you're saying, please don't do this, right? Your daughter wants to connect with you. Your daughter probably doesn't want to make you upset. But what's more important to her is that she feels safe and that she's able to stand upright. And so that means she's got to run her fingers down the walls of your house. And she said, it shifted her perspective and which behaviors she decided to try and continue addressing and how she decided to address those behaviors. So we saw an illustration of toxic stress. We've also probably seen or observed some of these classic trauma symptoms. This idea of re-experiencing the event. So flashbacks, reliving the trauma over and over, bad dreams or frightening thoughts, avoidance symptoms. So staying away from places, events, or objects that remind you of that experience. Sometimes just numbing out or being hyper aroused, constantly on edge, constantly surveying your environment to try and feel safe. Right? These are normal adaptations to being exposed to trauma. So I want us to think about here this idea around arousal and dissociative stress response. I want us to acknowledge that we all have these two systems and our bodies can use both of these systems simultaneously in order to keep us safe. The arousal response is kind of the picture here that we're supposed to see around Hulk, right? It's this angry, aggressive, the fight or flight response. That's our arousal response. The other image, if you can see it, is supposed to be, I think it's a silhouette of an individual who's kind of curled in on themselves, right? It's like the fetal position, so to speak, right? Arousal and dissociative. Dissociative response is like, here, we'll show you the illustrations. So an arousal example is on the far left of this, what you're seeing is the description of the behaviors. So you may see these behaviors show up. Increased vigilance. So scanning the environment constantly. Impulsive actions and reactions. Defiance, aggression, anxiety, exaggerated responses, right? We see a lot of this. Working in the group home, I saw a lot of those responses that didn't seem to fit the situation. You ask a kid to put on their shoes and you'd be like, whoa, what is going on here? On the right side of the slide, what you're seeing is the internal physiological description of what's going on. Increased sympathetic response. So that's that gasoline on the fire. So your heart rate increases, your blood pressure increases because you're starting to activate your large body muscles so that you can run or fight. Eye blink, pupils dilate, your bladder relaxes, your digestion kind of shuts down, and your focus is on the external threat, and your internal cues are not prioritized. So you may not even feel what's going on inside of your body. You are so ready and activated to attack, to run, to protect yourself. What I need us to know is we all have both of these systems, and you may pull in elements of both of these systems depending upon the situation. If your immediate assessment of the situation is that this is something you can run from, or this is something you can fight, you're more likely to go toward the Hulk side of and you're going to run from the situation. You're going to fight the situation. If you are in a situation where maybe there's a power differential dynamic, think about child sexual abuse, and there's nowhere to run. There's nowhere to hide. You can't escape the situation. You may be more likely to use the dissociative response to just survive. So behaviorally, that looks like withdrawal. That looks like compliance. I think we need to be very mindful of this, is that dissociative compliance is that nodding your head. It's the, I just want to please you because I know that if if I just am agreeable, this interaction will end faster. And the thing I think we need to know is that if you then try and process that experience later, you'll observe that the individual may have very little memory of what they said yes to, so to speak, right? They're losing memory or skills. I saw this all the time in the courtroom, where you got a judge sitting up high on the dais, and you have a parent there, and there's allegations of child abuse and neglect, and the judge is talking to the parent, and the parent's nodding along, and the attorney is whispering in their ear, and they're nodding along, and everybody signs an agreement, and we walk out of the courtroom, and then I go over and try and talk to the parent, and I ask them, what just happened? Do you understand what you just agreed to? And they have no recollection of the words that were happening and what was being said to them in the moment, right? What that is that is an example of they knew that they couldn't run from the moment. They couldn't get up and run out of that courtroom. And so maybe the response that they activated was the dissociative response, and their nodding of the head was a compliance dissociative, let's just end this interaction, let's just get me out of this. But it's not I understand what you're saying and I agree and I consent to what we're discussing. And on the right side, again, this is what it feels like inside of your body. So increased parasympathetic activity. This is your vagus nerve. So your heart rate decreases. It's kind of like the possum, right? Like you try and slow everything down. Eye blink and eye roll occur. You just try and leave the situation neurologically if you can't leave the situation physically. And your internal focus, that's why you may curl in on yourself. You're trying to protect your organs and protect yourself and protect your body. Before I move on, do we have questions about the Hulk or the dissociative response? So the arousal or dissociative response. Any clarification questions there?
Hi, Cody. This is Jody. I am wondering, what is decrease in peripheral circulation? Can you clarify, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jody. So this could be your hands get really cold because you're getting less blood flow to your hands and to your feet because your blood is concentrating its efforts on your lungs and your internal organs. So you're literally having less blood flow and oxygenated blood to your hands and fingers. This is the polar opposite of the individual on the arousal continuum who's ready to fight. And their fingers may be shaking as adrenaline and cortisol are flooding through their system, and they are ready and activated to run in the moment. Thank you for the question, Jody.
Thank you.
The other thing I want us to think about here is how this plays out, maybe starting even in early infancy. So the infant who's exposed to something, a loud noise, their first response is to try and get your attention, right? So they may call out because they know that they cannot fight. The infant knows that they can't fight their way or run their way out of a situation. So they're going to use what they have. They're going to cry to try and get you to respond, to take you with them or to fight on their behalf. But if the infant cries and a caregiver doesn't respond, right? That infant may just stop crying out. So our first response in a stressful situation is often, Dr. Bruce Perry uses this term flocking, right? We look around, we try and find somebody else to connect with. We flock first. And it's only when we don't feel like we can flock, when we miss our opportunity to flock, or we feel like the humans around us aren't people that we can connect with that will keep us safe, is when we go to the fight, flight, freeze, appease, and we continue down our response. So when you're working with older youth or adults, sometimes the frequency and intensity and the nature of adverse experiences creates a different sort of response. What once was a sensitive response to something fearful, like run or hide or jump or flinch, has now become muted or numb. That anhedonia, that just like they're numb to everything. There's an inability to receive pleasure from activities or less interest in activities that were once pleasurable. So that's this sense of like, there's just decreased pleasure from the things that they're doing. Some situations, there's this sense of learned helplessness. It's important to note that while this may not look like fear or trauma, it is still for many people a sign of a trauma response. And one personal solution here could be, you'll see individuals who pick at their skin or who cut as a way to just activate that neurological sense and to feel something, right? A way to disrupt that numbing. It's also a way to have a sense of power and control. We would see this with kids in the group home all the time, where they would, we had lots of challenges with encopresis and enuresis. So lots of challenges with bowel movements and with urination. And it was a way in which, especially kids who'd been the victims of sexual abuse, could exercise or feel some sense of control over their own body. But they also had decreased neural connections to even know about their internal body state. So part of it was also a representation of one of the ways to keep yourself safe if you can't escape the situation is to disconnect. So literally they had neurological adaptations that led to large gross body movement mobility issues, which means that for them, they were very clumsy, and we made, and therapy for that sort of a situation, that sort of an adaptation, is not sitting and talking about your trauma. Therapy is playing soccer outside, running, jumping, large body movements to activate those neurons and try and create new neural connections in the same regions of the brain that might have adapted and changed because of the trauma. So I just want to dive in here and use this idea. So again, we have both the sympathetic, the arousal, the Hulk response, and the parasympathetic, the dissociative response. And we can use both of them simultaneously. We may use both of them in different situations. We may have kind of a nurtured preference, so to speak. We have found that hulking out works for us in a lot of situations, or we found that dissociating works for us in many situations. And so that's kind of the way that we roll, right? It's been said that the eyes are the window to our soul. They can also be helpful in seeing the stress response as it is happening, which helps us respond in a more trauma-informed way to avoid responding in a less productive way. Remember that one aspect of the dissociative response is eye roll, where the eyes kind of roll back in your head. So Dr. Dan Spiegel developed a simple test for this, which gives us a very crude, a rough approximation of someone's dissociative tendency. You can test your own tendency by just, taking a picture of yourself with the selfie on your phone. And I'll show you an illustration of this. So this is using the eye roll test. You just kind of look up and try and see how far you can look up. And you'll see here that I'm at about a 3 or a 4. So what this lets you know is that I have a very strong dissociation response. In fact, in most situations where I'm met with an increased sense of stress, I am likely to dissociate rather than become the Hulk. So you may observe my behavior as being like, oh, Cody seems like he's fine. He's really collected. You know, it seems like a very stressful situation, but he's not, he doesn't seem disturbed at all. That's because neurologically, I've left the room. I'm gone. Physically, I might still be there, but I have checked out and I am in fantasy world. I am thinking about something else because that is my kind of preferred way of navigating lots of stressful situations. So how could this be helpful if you knew this about your clients? Remember, an arousal response is lots of rapid blinking. So maybe by just being really good active listeners and being attuned to and paying attention to the body cues of both ourselves and to the clients that we're working with, we may start to see, oh, you know what? Like, I know that I'm working with a client and I just watched them I asked them a question about something and I saw their eyes roll for a second. Maybe something about that question was a little bit hard for them. Maybe I need to change up my questions, slow down give them some space, create an opportunity for regulation, because I might be observing that they're starting to disassociate. And remember that we want to flock first. So if you observe someone who's dissociating and you create an opportunity for connection and you try and be someone that they can flock with, you can kind of start to bring them back into the situation and back into the present, right? As they start to experience you as a safe person to be in the presence with. Another thing that we need to be mindful of is that sometimes we just don't know. We don't know what could be triggering ourselves or others. Sometimes it's the smell of alcohol or cologne. Shamefully, I had one night where we'd been working at the group home and went out and relaxed pretty heavily and came in the next morning, was rather hungover. And I have a vivid memory of a 9-year-old coming up and giving me a hug and telling me that I smelled like a family member. And I realized that like literally the alcohol was pouring out of me. And that was a shameful moment for me. And I realized, you know, this individual, she happened to handle it pretty well, but it easily could have gone a different path. And that our scent is a powerful trauma trigger. It can be. Unexpected loud noises like fireworks, the backfire of a car, right? This can trigger individuals in a heartbeat. So we started touching on this last time, this idea of intergenerational trauma and the concept of epigenetics. And there is lots of room for debate and conversation around this because this is really, really new science. I think what it's trying to articulate to us is that the experiences of our ancestors, some of those might influence us in profound and subtle ways. And if we're not creating space for and conversations around this, we may be making inappropriate decisions or might be misguided in our treatment attempts. There's evidence from a study of rats showing that how nurturing a caregiver is can be kind of passed on from generation to generation. So it's not just if you were nurtured well, you learn the skills to nurture well, but they've actually also seen by taking rats and putting them with different caregivers, and one that's less nurturing and one that's more nurturing, they've actually seen that there's this intergenerational transmission of nurturing, which is really intriguing and interesting about what could we do if we really understood this? How might we adapt our society if we understood how the experiences of parents and how they're able to provide caregiving for those first 5 years of life is so critical Might we invest in making sure all parents have the resources and support they need to be as present and as nurturing as possible for those first 5 years of life? We may have very different policies in place around family leave and approaches like that, understanding the lifelong implications of that early nurturing and the multi-generational implications of that type of nurturing. So what I also wanted to focus on here is this idea that when we're talking about racial trauma, there's no clean end, meaning that it's not like a traumatic experience, that a car accident that happened one time and then you're trying to overcome that experience. It's the insidious, continuous nature of this trauma. And so what we're looking at here is both Black and white maternal mortality in the United States of America. And you see really startling evidence here. One group of Americans with an undeniable history of oppression, Black people. Recent research is starting to put 2 and 2 together and exploring the hypothesis that 400 years of collective oppression, slavery, Jim Crow, structural and interpersonal racism is bound to have physiological outcomes. The data on infant and maternal mortality in the US is alarming. This chart depicts maternal mortality rate for Black women in the second graph from the left, more than 3 times the rate for white women. Also alarming is that even when you include Black women with high socioeconomic status, the rates continue to be remarkably worse. Right? This led to this articulation in the New York Times. The reasons for Black and white divide in both infant and maternal mortality have been debated by researchers and doctors for more than 2 decades, but recently there has been growing acceptance of what has largely been for the medical establishment a shocking idea. For Black women in America is an inescapable atmosphere of societal and systemic racism, can create a kind of toxic physiological stress resulting in conditions including hypertension and preeclampsia that lead directly to higher rates of infant and maternal death. And that societal racism is further expressed in a pervasive, long-standing racial bias in healthcare, including the dismissal of legitimate concerns and symptoms that can help explain poor birth outcomes, even in the case of Black women with the most advantages. So I bring that up because I think that we need to continue this conversation about racism and how it's impacting our care and how it's impacting outcomes. And we need to look at all of our data outcomes and disaggregate it across any data metrics that we have to observe who are the individuals that we're providing, that we could do a better job of providing care to. And maybe it's across racial demographics, maybe it's across socioeconomics. Maybe it's across insurance status. Maybe there are other things that are influencing the quality of care that we provide, but if we're not paying attention to it, if we're not asking who's working and for whom, we may inadvertently be just maintaining really disparate outcomes for different people depending upon how we're offering the services that we provide. Okay, so I'm gonna touch on worldview here pretty quick. We're looking at both the typical development versus developmental trauma, this idea. So typical development, let's say the infant who grows up in a household, and please know that we're using these words and they're not the right words. We need to continue finding other language here. But the idea is we have lots of what we call neurodiversity. But in the household where an individual is met with care and consistency and love and nurturing and safety, that infant, each time they cry, mom, dad, the primary caregiver picks them up, changes them, provides consistent care to them, they're learning that humans are safe. They learn and develop this kind of relational tolerance. meaning that they learn and focus on relationships with humans, and they develop a stronger capacity to nurture more and more relationships with humans because humans have thus far been safe individuals. They have kind of an orientation that bad things, when they happen, those are accidents. That risk is reinforced. You get a positive reinforcement. If you're familiar with the circle of security model, it's this idea that when you nurture strong, stable, safe relationships with the primary caregiver, then children are more able to safely explore their environment, and they constantly look back to their caregiver for reassurance that it's safe to continue exploring. And that through that interaction, their risk and their exploration is reinforced positively. On the other end, you have the interactions where individuals are harmed. There's adversity, and people adapt to believe that humans are threatening. And they have relational sensitivity, meaning that they may be slow to trust. It may take a long time to nurture a relationship with an individual who's experienced developmental trauma, appropriately so, because they've been harmed in relationships, so they're slow to form relationships. And then what might be perceived as a minor slight, you miss an appointment, is perceived as a really egregious offense because of that relational sensitivity. They also may have a perspective that bad things happen on purpose. Risk is not reinforced. That you haven't had the experiences that tell you that taking new risks is safe, and you prioritize safety. The idea being that both of these responses are adaptive. And how does our world look differently if we're looking at it through the lens of, quote, typical development? And we look at the world as humans are safe. When bad things happen, it's just an accident. You're reinforced for taking risks and trying new things. How is your world different versus if you've had experiences where humans are unsafe? It's not safe to form relationships. When I do, I've got to be very careful because people are probably going to hurt me. And when they do, it's on purpose. How is your whole perspective on the world maybe different from those two contexts? So I'm going to skip this next video. We'll send out the link for you to watch it. There's a really powerful video that talks about its survivors talking about their experiences of trauma. So, you know, trigger warning, it may not be something that you want to observe. You may have plenty of access to these stories every day in your current work. But I do want us to bring in those stories and to continue to think about and understand that those could be adaptive responses, and that their behaviors, whether they're arousal behaviors or dissociative behaviors, are adaptive responses and have likely been very helpful for them to just survive. All right, so we're going to continue on here rapidly, and we'll get through as much of this as we can, and if we need to carry some over, we'll carry some over. So now we're going to touch on perspective shift. Before I get there, are there any questions? Let me just pause. Are there any questions on impact and what we just covered? All right. Sorry, that was not a very well facilitated question time when I said, hey, we don't have much time, and then I asked for your questions. My apologies. So we'll go ahead and keep going. Please don't hesitate to add a question, because that is how this learning occurs. So we're going to touch now on perspective shift, this concept. Really, we're going to be touching on how do we identify our current perspective. How do we shift our perspective? How do we understand that our perspective is in itself a powerful intervention? So quickly, does anybody see something wrong with the illustration on this screen, on this slide? There's something wrong with this illustration. You can either take yourself off mute or throw it in the chat. Of course, I can't see the chat. I don't know why. My dog wants to be heard. 1 second. All right, so the problem with this illustration, can't see the chat, I apologize, but the problem here, right, is that the Earth is in the middle. And we know that the Earth is not the center of our solar system, the sun is. But if you remember, what happened when people started to question this perspective? You remember the story of Galileo? And that people didn't respond very kindly to him suggesting that, hey, maybe what needs to change here is our perspective. And again, perspective is a very powerful intervention place. So here we have, on the far left is a picture of what looks like super appetizing bread, right? If you were to go to a doctor and you have an infection and you need penicillin, literally penicillin is that same substance on the left. But I imagine that if the doctor just scraped that mold off of the bread with a butter knife and told you to lick a butter knife, it probably, even if you were a medical provider, you may not be able to stomach it. You may literally not be able to lick that butter knife, even though you know it's exactly what you need. That little red pill, it's the same substance or similar substance, just packaged differently. And so perspective shift is super powerful. It can actually elicit different behavioral responses. You go from gagging and not being able to swallow the substance that you know will heal you to willingly swallowing that pill, you know, for the next 7 days until you get rid of your infection. Perception is an intervention. So I want you to look at this here for a second and go ahead and throw in the chat, which way do you see the silhouette spinning? Is the silhouette spinning clockwise or counterclockwise? There it is. Let's stop the chat. Clockwise, counterclockwise. I'm seeing a bunch of different counterclockwise. So how is it that some people are seeing this silhouette spin one direction and others are seeing it spin a different direction? And actually, no, it's not spinning. There we go. How is it that some of us are seeing it spin one direction and some of us are seeing it spin another direction? Any thoughts on that? How can one image, and some people are saying it's spinning both ways. Tammy can see it spin both ways. So can Katrina. So can Amber. I still can't see it spin both ways. I don't know what's going on. I'm convinced you guys are fibbing me that you can see it spin both ways. So here is one way of understanding what we're seeing there is that we have two different hemispheres in our brain, our right hemisphere and our left hemisphere. And our right hemisphere controls the left side of our body and vice versa. And whichever hemisphere is more dominant in the moment, that eye, well, the opposite eye, is influencing how we're seeing it spin. But what we understand about the hemispheres of the brain has evolved a lot. I know that when I was in school as a young man, right, we heard right brain people did blah and left brain people were better at this. Most of that is inaccurate. Most of that they've learned through stroke victims is that, you know, we at one point thought that you could only do math on one side of your hemisphere and art was on another side. And what they've now figured out is that those are inaccurate, that people can relearn those skills, even if they have damage to one whole hemisphere. But there is some really powerful differences across our hemispheres. And for this, we're just going to listen to a couple of minutes from this amazing podcast from Hidden Brain, One Head, Two Brains. And let me make sure Marlena, give me a thumbs up if you can hear this when I press play.
These experiments showed the left and right hemisphere approach everyday tasks very differently. The left focuses on narrow details, the right on general vigilance. To use a basketball analogy, the left hemisphere is focused on the mechanics of dunking the basketball. The right on where all the players are, the current situation in the game. One sees the small picture, the other, the big picture. You see something similar when it comes to language.
Language has many components. One of them is attending to the tone of voice in which I say something. For example, I can say yes, or I can say yes. I can intone that in probably a dozen different ways with quite different meanings. So, for example, I say, it's a bit hot in here. You, using your right hemisphere, know that what I mean is, could we have the door open? Could we put on the air conditioning? But your left hemisphere is wondering, meanwhile, why I'm supplying this quite unnecessary meteorological information.
So it's really focused on sort of the granular detail.
Yes.
Yeah.
And because of this, all kinds of things happen. Because of its narrow focus, it doesn't see anything that isn't explicit. It only sees what's right in the center of the focus of attention. And it doesn't understand things that are not said. Often that's as important as what is said. The way in which it is said, my facial expression, my body language, all of this is lost, as well as the interpretation in the whole picture.
One of the important differences you point out is sort of understanding the role of metaphor in language, for
that's very
example,
important.
which is that the left hemisphere really is incapable of understanding what metaphor is or how it works.
Yes, and that's no small thing, because as some philosophers have pointed out, metaphor is how we understand everything. And they point out that actually particularly scientific and philosophical understanding is mediated by metaphors. In other words, the only way we can understand something is in terms of something else that we think we already understand. And it's making the analogy, which is what a metaphor does, that enables us to go, I see, I get it. Now, if you think that metaphor is just one of those dispensable decorations that you could add to meaning, it's kind of nice, but probably a distraction from the real meaning. You've got it upside down, because if you don't understand the metaphor, you haven't understood the meaning. Literal meaning, however, is a peripheral, diminished version of the richness of metaphorical understanding. And what we know is the right hemisphere understands those implicit meanings, those connections of meanings, what we call connotations, as well as just denotations. It understands imagery, it understands humor, it understands all of that.
Do the hemispheres differ in how they think about time, their orientation towards the future and their orientation toward the past?
Well, that's an interesting question, and not in a clear-cut way, although the left hemisphere is tending to look for the next opportunity, so it's very goal-driven, but very short-term goal-driven. It wants to grasp things that are within reach. Remember, the left hemisphere is what controls our right hand, with which we grasp things that are within reach. So it has a very direct, linear idea of a target, and let's go and get it.
Is some of this played out in sort of the relationship they have with tradition, with history, as you say? In some ways, if I'm primarily focused on what's right in front of me, I don't really need to know what the last 2,000 years of history have taught me.
I think that's certainly right. Time can be seen rather like the flow of a river, which isn't made up of slices or chunks of river that are then put together. We as personalities in time, our cultures in time, are like this flow. The left hemisphere can't deal with anything that is moving. It fixes things. It likes things to be fixed because then you can grab them. You can't grasp your prey. You can't pick up something unless you can at least immobilize it for that second while you're interacting with it. So it doesn't like flow and motion, which are, in my view, basic to not just life, but actually to the cosmos. So instead, it sees lots of little punctate moments, little slices of time, and things have to be put together by adding them up.
I mean, it's almost like a form of calculus, of taking slices and then trying to integrate them together.
You're absolutely right. And calculus is an attempt, actually, to achieve something which is indivisible by dividing it into slices.
All right. So the idea that I'm trying to bring forward here is that, in the moment, we may be a little bit more focused on the details, or we may be seeing the larger picture. And for those of us that are seeing it spin one direction versus the other, we're seeing it primarily with one hemisphere of our brain. And for those of you that were seeing it spin both directions, you are rapidly moving across your corpus callosum between the two hemispheres, and you're able to bounce back and forth. And we'll come to another slide where I'll give you the opportunity to experience it. All of us will be able to experience the silhouette spinning both directions by using some other cues to help us do that. But I wanted to do this because I think we need to dive in a little bit deeper to the neuroscience here. And I'm going to share another illustration. So to kind of reinforce this perspective shift concept, let's look at Dr. Rizzolatti's research. He made an important discovery about 20 years ago, discovered that monkeys have activity in the parts of their brain that control motor activity when they were just watching another monkey do a task. This led to the concept that you see before you of mirror neurons. The potential implications are pretty far reaching. The question is it possible that watching activities in others produces similar neural stimulation as if we were actually doing it ourselves? What does that say about the impact of watching something? And are the roots of empathy involved in this process? The capacity can be demonstrated. If I say the word yawn 6 times, then some of you will start to yawn. Others of you will know that it is the expectation, and you will fight a yawn by trying to stifle it. Usually, stifling a yawn produces a smile, a good trick to get the mouth to do something other than yawn. That is 5 times, by the way, that I've said yawn. When you see the smiles instead of yawns on the faces of your colleagues, most people can't stop but help to smile or fight a smile in return. The gift of smiling being contagious can be directly attributed to mirror neurons. And I do think the roots of empathy are laced in this, right? Empathy at its core is our ability to feel somebody else's pain or to feel their pressure, to feel what they're feeling. And I'll use a quick illustration of this. I can tell you from my case study of 2 that empathy starts to come online at around age 3 or 4. Because I've had this experience with both of my young boys around the same age. One was with my son Dylan while we were playing Legos, and he went to pull some Legos apart, and he accidentally hit me in the face with his hand. And my glasses flew against my nose, broke open the bridge of my nose, so I was bleeding. It was in a fair bit of pain, and I didn't want to make much noise because it was 4:30 in the morning, and his mom, my partner, was still asleep. And I'm there, and I'm holding my head because it hurts, and I look over and I see my son do something immediately. And he puts his own hand to his own head. And then he starts to cry. And in the moment, I'm both really excited that my son is learning and developing empathy, and really frustrated that this is happening at 4:30 in the morning, that my son is now crying, and now Katie is awake and she's wondering what's going on, and I have blood on my nose and I'm trying to explain the situation, right? Mirror neurons and relationship facilitated that. My son put his own hand to his own head because literally his head hurt because he was feeling the pain that I was feeling. And then because he didn't like that feeling, he started to cry. So how does this impact and influence this next concept of polyvagal theory? And this is a theory that we could literally spend 6 hours on, and we don't have that time. But I'm going to touch on, and I invite you to explore, what do you think is happening in this picture? And what do you think is going to happen next? So looking at this image on the screen, what do you think's happening? And what do you think's going to happen next? Sorry about that. I need to close my chat. Let me try this one more time so I can actually see the chat while I'm sharing with you. So
looks like maybe she's going to push him away.
Ah, she's going to push him away. Others see the same thing or see something different? Why do you think that, Christy?
Her smile doesn't look genuine. It looks a little tense, like it's a smile, that uncomfortable smile when you feel awkward and uncomfortable.
Okay. Is there anything else about her body or his body that's communicating?
Her shoulders look raised and her hands are on his chest.
Ah, so the shoulders kind of hunched up like this, the hand on the chest, and the smile are your indication. Beautiful.
And he's leaning over very aggressively.
Ah, his physical posture. Okay. Anyone see something different than Christy and LaDonna? Anybody see a different interaction occurring? Or think something different is going to happen next? Go ahead, Jody.
Yeah, I see it as being playful and maybe she'll kiss him back.
Okay. Yeah.
That's how I saw it too.
That's how you see it too, Deborah? Yeah, right? It's interesting here, right? How can we all see the same picture and infer different things? And there's a reason why we're not using a video, right? Because movement might confirm one of your suspicions more, right? Like maybe if Jody and Deborah saw 10 seconds of this interaction, they would be like, oh no, I see what LaDonna and Christy see. And vice versa, maybe a 10 seconds of movement here. But I think it's important that we identify that we can look at this and we can draw very different kind of assumptions about what's going on by all of these subtle nuances and clues and these ideas around. And some of that may be influenced by our own perception of the world or what we may think about that situation, right? Maybe we've had some experiences, we've been in similar sort of playful interactions and we're like, no, that's a playful, she's gonna kiss him back. Maybe we've had some other interactions or we've seen some other things in our own lived experience and maybe we're saying, I don't know. Something about her shoulders and her hand are telling me that she's not into this and she wants to get away. That's that disassociation sort of like, I want to get away, but I'm not going to fight, right? Like it's this, let's get this over with, or let's figure out a way through this as fast as we can, right? And what I want you to, the most critical thing here is that our own beliefs are impacting our perception. And that's the purpose of this whole, right? Our perspective, how would it influence this interaction? If you're working with a client and you observe this, if your perception is she is in danger, she wants to get away, right? You may be bringing into the situation something that is not actually happening. And it's your own perception that is bringing in and inviting in that experience, right? So this is back to this idea that our perception is a powerful intervention point. And polyvagal theory is essentially the science, the way I understand it, and trust me, I'm on a learning journey here. So chances are, if you hear me talking about this 2 years from now, I'll probably say something totally different. So I apologize for whatever I communicate right now. It's what I understand right now. But my understanding of this is it's the science that confirms the language that we've had for a long time. Trust your gut. You've probably heard that statement. If you're a social worker, you've probably used that in your work. Trust your gut. What do we mean? Well, it's that, I don't know, it's the feeling I get. It kind of comes from down here, that something just isn't right, something's off. It's the feeling that gets triggered when I'm walking down a dark alley, something like that. Okay. Your vagus nerve is the largest nerve. It connects your brainstem to your lungs and to your stomach. So when you say, I get that butterfly feeling in my stomach, that's your vagus nerve being activated, communicating to your brainstem, something ain't right. Hey, pay attention. We are unsafe. The vagus nerve is kind of your home security system for your body. It's constantly on, it's in the background, checking things out. Most of the time, it's just kind of, it's going between what we call dorsal vagal and ventral vagal. And I'm going to confuse them right now, so I'm not going to dive further into that. But it's this idea around, right, the fire and water, the sympathetic nervous system. So you turn it up. So when you turn up that fight or flight response, your dorsal, your polyvagal response is shut down digestion, increase your lungs, increase your heart rate. Let's get out of here. Let's fight. So that's all your ventral vagal or your dorsal. I'm forgetting them right now, so don't quote me on those. But it's your vagus response right then. And then when you turn it down, your parasympathetic, your dissociative response is that slowing down of your lungs, curling inward, right? You're slowing down, as Jody asked earlier, you're slowing down of your circulation because literally your heartbeat is slowing down. So your blood is prioritizing sending oxygen to the places where you have and need it the most. So you're focusing on internal organs, and you may start to get the tingling in your fingers and your toes because you're getting less and less circulation there. When we think about a fire, right? So you can turn it up and you can turn it down, right? That's the parasympathetic and sympathetic. So you can add gas to the fire, you can turn down the gas, but fires need fuel and oxygen to burn. So I want us as helpers and healers to think about and understand that our presence can either bring oxygen into the situation or pull oxygen out of the situation, that we literally can influence the flow of oxygen by how we show up. And we are communicating that mirror neurons, all of that network is fully online. So for a playful illustration of this, imagine the Office episode, if you've seen the fire drill episode. And we can think about this concept of a fire drill. So you're in bed, you're asleep, you're in your household, you're a child, and a caregiver comes into your room, right? Opens the door, comes in, shakes you awake and says, the house is on fire. We've got to get outside. We've already, the cat and dog are outside already. Mommy, auntie, whoever is outside the window, I'm going to hand you out the window to them, and we're going to our meeting spot across the, we don't have time to grab anything. We got to get out of the house, right? It's a scary situation, but hopefully something about my tone of voice, my body posture, even though we're not in the same room, you can see through this little window, you can see that what I'm articulating, I'm kind of pulling the oxygen out of the scary situation. I'm communicating to you that, yes, this is scary, but we've got this, got it under control. Imagine your flight attendant and there's turbulence and they come on, and what do? Hopefully they beautifully illustrate and they try and use the vagus system to tell us all, okay, there's going to be a little bit of turbulence right now. The pilot has put on the fasten seatbelt sign, relax in your chairs, right? They give you some boundaries, some context. It's going to be for the next 30 minutes, blah, blah, blah. You kind of feel, oh, okay, somebody's got this. Cool. Alternatively, your caregiver comes in, wakes you up, says, the house is on fire, and runs out of the room, right? Now the fuel is already on because you heard the word fire, and now they just threw a whole bunch of oxygen in there, and you now have that experience of like, oh my God, I'm all alone in this. There's nobody I can flock with. There's nobody that can keep me safe. So if I'm stitching this all together, your facial expression, your tone of voice, you can elicit through mirror neurons a similar response. And you can either breathe oxygen into the situation, you can help someone calm down, or you can escalate the situation by your tone of voice, your body posture, your language. All of those things are powerful resources that you have at your disposal. Again, if you're conscious of your own perspective in the moment, it's really hard to offer somebody regulation if you yourself are dysregulated in the moment. So you've got to be mindful of your own perspective. How am I feeling? Am I triggered? Am I upset? So that then you can give the gift of regulation to somebody else. And, I saw this all the time in the group home where what we would do is you'd have a kid screaming in your face, and we were taught and we would coach, and I would train other staff on whispering. Because you can use the mirror neuron network and you can watch somebody, they're still angry, but they're suddenly whispering. And if you've ever had someone angry whisper at you, it's really interesting and kind of funny, right? Because it doesn't line up neurologically with the way that you want to communicate. You want to scream because you're angry. You want to hulk. And if you just start whispering, you can literally kind of pull somebody into a different state by the way that you communicate. So I am going to look at the time here. Yeah, so I'm going to give you some homework over the weekend. Don't worry, it's fun. I'm going to invite you to take the implicit association test through Harvard, and the link is in the resource document. And there are, I don't even know how many implicit association tests. You can do one about your beliefs about different political parties. You can do one about your beliefs about able body status, about gender, about sexual orientation, about race. There are about age, adultism, ageism. You can do all these different association tests in an attempt to understand and bring some awareness to what is your perspective with different groups of humans that you may serve. Because your perspective might be influencing the outcomes. And if we're not even mindful of it, then we can't influence it, right? Then we can't impact it if we're not even conscious that it might be influencing things. So there's the link as well. It'll be in the slides. So we're just going to kind of round out this perception and perspective shift idea. So one perception, and it shows up in the language, especially the language we use when we're frustrated, right? Because I think people will learn and have learned, quote, politically correct terms, right? They've started to learn person-first language. But when they get frustrated, when they get upset, you may see them, instead of saying somebody's struggling with substance use, you'll hear them say the word addict, right? It's subtle, but it's an illustration of maybe where our thinking is right now. And are we still seeing individuals from kind of a more traditional, meaning a non-trauma informed perspective, where we're using words like acting out, or they have anger management problems? They're being naughty, manipulative, right? Alternatively, we can look for different language. They're dysregulated. They're scared. This is an adaptive behavior. They're trying to get their needs met. What need are they trying to get met? Instead of manipulative, they're trying to get their needs met. Now, I want us to be mindful that changing our language can be powerful. It takes some time, but I think that changing our language can be an intervention that can help to change our perspective and our perception. I don't think it's sufficient in and of itself. I think to truly change our perception, we need opportunities to reflect on the information that we've heard, think about our own life through this new context, and we also need access to other people's stories. Another way, so that was for children. Now, how do we view adults? This is the language that we used all the time in child welfare: non-compliant. The client is non-compliant, right? Instead of thinking about it from the language of they're seeking control, they're scared. Lazy becomes helplessness. And I think there was a participant earlier who articulated working in housing, right? And that sense of helplessness. Yeah, absolutely, or hopelessness, right? This isn't somebody who's lazy and unwilling to go fill out another application for a housing unit that is unavailable, right? And that may be one perception that we have. Actually, it's someone who has no hope because they don't believe that this action will help them accomplish their ultimate goal. Okay, how do we think about that? Yeah. So, okay, we've got this point across that our perception matters. Well, how do we shift our perception? How do we change it? How do we help our clients change their perception as well? One way is with this amazing miracle question, and I'm biased because I'm a social worker, and this is one of our favorite little tricks or techniques. But it's this idea of you ask someone to consider a possibility in a future. So it's a visioning technique. And you say, you wake up tomorrow and whatever you were hoping for has happened, right? So you're working with a client around their substance use. You wake up tomorrow and everything is exactly the way you wanted it to be. The world is the way you want it. What's the first thing you start to notice that tells you something's different? You get them to actually think about waking up in the morning and how do they first notice? What's their first behavioral cue? What's their first indication that a miracle happened last night? Oh, well, I wake up and I don't have this urge to do blah, 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 right? Or I wake up in the morning and I'm on my way to work and I first see that there aren't people sleeping on the streets anymore, right? And that's my first indication that we as a society solved the experiences of people experiencing homelessness, right? So whatever the miracle is, you start to really, and the intention is you get people to really vision out clearly what they're viewing and what they're believing. You can also use changing the tense. So you're working with a client and oftentimes with youth in foster care, the present tense was painful, but it was also the only thing that they were willing to consider, right? So however I'm feeling right now is how I'm going to feel forever. And so you invite in, is there ever a time when you didn't feel the way that you do right now, right? So you're asking them to think back in the past, or you ask them to shift forward. Do you think that there's a possibility that you won't feel like this someday? What would be different when you no longer feel this way, right? So these are some ways in which you can start to shift that perspective, both for yourself and for the individuals that you work with. Again, obviously a strength or resiliency focus, and that was mentioned earlier in the chat, the strength-based approach. And we also need to be mindful of addressing our bias. Intention, attention, time, right? So being mindful of all these things is really, really important. Any thoughts on other strategies to shift our perspective? So what we need to know is that we developed our perceptions and our current behavior patterns over millions of repetitions, right? That's how that neural network got really strong. So if you're going to create a new neural network, you got to be patient with yourself. You also got to be mindful about dosing, right? If you're going to practice trauma-informed care, it isn't something that you're going to do for 6 hours once a week. Instead, try one strategy 5 times a day for 3 minutes, right? It's that type of approach that can lead to an increased change in behavior. We need to think about this with our clients too. Instead of, maybe focusing on, oh, you're going to go to therapy once a week for an hour. How could we explore other ways to help them find healing where we increase the dosing? Let's do something that you love to do, and let's do it every single day, 3 times a day, right? Just do it for 5 minutes, 3 times a day, every single day, instead of this once a week sort of intervention approach. If we're trying to create new neural networks, it's that type of repetition that we need to invest in. So now, hopefully you've had the opportunity to see and shift perspective. So you can look at the silhouette in the middle, and then if you look at the one on the right, you can get her to spin one direction. If you look at the one on the left, you can get her to spin the other direction. Can people all see the silhouette spin in both directions now? So we are basically at time. Yes, we'll get copies of the slides. Unfortunately, they are intellectual property, so I can't send out the PowerPoint slides, but I'll send a PDF of the slides. So the slide you get won't get the silhouette spinning, but I'm sure you can Google search a silhouette spinning and get something close. So if that's something that you're intrigued by or that you want to be able to share. But we will, actually that resource document, I'll just update that and it'll have the PDF of the slides in that resource document. So as long as you have that resource document, you should be able to access everything through the links on there. Yes, thank you, Marlene. And the session 1 slides are in that resource document already. Are there any questions about this idea around perspective shift or impact in our last couple of minutes here together? One thing that we didn't get to today was another video that I intended to show you. This can be other homework if you want it. But it's a really quick, short video from Alberta Family Wellness on how brains are built. It's like a 4-minute video. It's really engaging. And the reason why I wanted to show you this, and again, it's linked in our resource document, is that Alberta Family Wellness also has a free online course that you can take at your leisure that is really in depth into all of the science that we're covering. And they had the globe's leading experts across, they flew in the experts across all over the planet to do presentations in their community, and they recorded them and then they broke it up into chunks, into little segments. So it's you know, it's as engaging as watching a presentation in community is. And then there's little quiz segments that help you kind of reinforce the learning and make sure that you're understanding it. So Alberta Family Wellness Initiative is really got some fabulous materials if you just are hungry to keep learning and want to keep engaging in this material. So any other questions about perspective shift and the impact of trauma while we're gathered together? Go ahead, Jody.
Hi, Cody. I find that storytelling is really important in doing perspective change, especially for clients, hearing other clients, possibly their outcomes and their struggle, and finding that identification really, really helps.
Thank you so much, Jody. Yeah, I don't know if you use narrative therapy, but that's kind of in a nutshell the idea, right? Is that stories are super powerful, and that's what the speaker on the Hidden Brain podcast was articulating, that we understand things through story. That's actually how humans communicate and understand information. And I think that that's becomes a really powerful intervention, is that you can actually work with somebody on their own personal narrative. What are they saying to and about themselves, and think that through. And then what you were also describing, Jody, is that you can give them access to other narratives that help them see other potentials, other solutions, or see a path forward for themselves. So we've been trying to do some work with our adult drug court here in Kitsap County around trying to capture some stories from some of the graduates of that program, and to write about moments when they were at their lowest, when they were ready to give up, right? Moments when they thought that they couldn't keep going. And we want to capture these stories and then give them to participants as they're heading into maybe a court-ordered sanction, meaning that they're going to have to spend some time in jail. It's a low point. They're generally there for some sort of violation with the program. And giving them access to the stories at that very moment might be a really powerful opportunity where they hear from somebody who they know is a graduate. Okay, right? So they're hearing a story about somebody else who was in a similar situation where they felt like there was no way they could move forward, and they did. And that access to that narrative can be just, right, that can be a turning point, targeted, tailored, and timely. It's given to people at a critical, pivotal, influential moment when they need to hear a story that resonates with them and that tells them that there's a future that they may be having trouble visioning right now. Beautiful. Thank you, Jody, for the comment. And we are at time, so if people need to leave, go ahead. If you want to stay for some more questions, go ahead and hang out. We'll go ahead and pause the recording. Thank you all so much for the honor to be gathered together and learning together. Thank you, everyone.